The alarm had been screaming for 11 minutes when Maren Voss walked onto Deck 9 with a cold cup of coffee and a datapad she hadn't finished reading. Every overhead panel strobed amber. The floor vibrated with the deep, gut-level thrum of a station whose core systems were arguing with each other and losing. 3 Corvathi technicians sprinted past her without a word, their 4-jointed legs clicking against the deck plating like a drawer full of knives being shaken. A 4th slammed into the wall to avoid hitting her, crest plates flat with panic, and kept running without looking back. She stopped at the primary diagnostic console. The screen was a mess, cascading fault reports stacked 6 deep, each one spawning 2 more before the previous line could finish rendering. But her eyes went straight to the bottom left corner, the way they always did, because that was where the station's classification engine dumped the things it couldn't name. Unresolvable 7. It blinked there in a color the console wasn't supposed to produce, a sickly amber white that sat between 2 standard display values the hardware had never been asked to render. The station's operating system had invented a new color to flag something it couldn't categorize. That alone told Maren more than the 900 lines of error text stacking above it. She set the coffee down on the edge of the console, thumbed her badge, Anomaly Specialist, Terran Division, Joint Station KETHARA, and pulled up the classification log. 39 minutes. That was the number on the countdown timer bolted to the wall above the main viewport. Not a human timer. Corvathi built their countdowns into the architecture, etched them into metal panels with chemical displays that couldn't be hacked or overridden. When the Corvathi Administrative Concord gave a station a deadline, they made sure the station could see itself dying. 39 minutes until Cathara's orbital corridor decayed below the threshold for atmospheric compensation. After that, the station's lower ring would begin venting. After that, 17,000 occupants, Corvathi, Dren, Palori, and 43 humans, would have roughly 4 minutes to reach the upper ring's sealed compartments before the pressure differential turned the connecting corridors into wind tunnels capable of stripping meat from bone. And the core systems were locked. Every repair pathway, every manual override, every emergency bypass routed through the same classification engine that was currently choking on Unresolvable 7. Specialist Voss. The voice came from behind her. Station Administrator Torin Kale, a Corvathi whose crest plates had gone the flat gray of sustained stress. He stood with 2 of his senior engineers, both of whom looked at Maren the way people looked at the last match in a box. "The error is in your domain." "Is it?" Maren said, not a question. She was already reading. "The classification engine will not release the repair pathways until the flagged anomaly is resolved. Our engineers have attempted to override the lock. It requires a classification decision from a registered anomaly specialist. And I'm the only one on the station. You are the only one in this sector." Maren pulled the classification log to the main screen and expanded the Unresolvable 7 entry. The data spilled out in a format she recognized, the Corvathi bureaucratic taxonomy, a system so thorough it had individual codes for 18 different types of dust, and a separate filing protocol for objects that existed in more than 3 spatial dimensions. The taxonomy had been running for 1100 years without a gap. It classified everything from microbial contamination to diplomatic incidents to the specific emotional state of a Corvathi whose crest plates had molted prematurely. Unresolvable 7 meant the engine had found something it couldn't fit into any of its 2.3 billion existing categories. Not unknown, the taxonomy had codes for unknown things. Not error, there were 400 subcategories of error. Unresolvable meant the engine had tried every branch of its decision tree, reached every leaf node, and found no match. The 7 meant it had tried 7 times. 37 minutes. "Walk me through what happened," Maren said. She pulled a second chair to the console and sat in it the way she sat in every crisis, leaned forward, elbows on knees, datapad balanced on one thigh. The posture of someone who planned to be there for a while. Torrens' crest plates shifted, impatience. The orbital stabilization array reported a variance at 3:40 station time. The classification engine flagged the variance for routing. The variance did not match any existing category. The engine escalated to unresolvable and locked all dependent systems pending resolution. All dependent systems, meaning the power grid. The power grid, the orbital correction thrusters, the atmospheric processors, and the emergency bulkhead controls. Marin stopped scrolling. Bulkhead controls. The classification engine treats them as power grid dependent. If the grid cannot be reconfigured, the bulkheads cannot be guaranteed to seal correctly. So if the orbit decays, and you need to seal the lower ring, you can't. Not until the classification is resolved. The weight of that settled over the console like a physical thing. 17,000 people, a decaying orbit, and the one system that could save them was waiting for someone to finish her paperwork. 35 minutes. Marin went back to the raw sensor data attached to the unresolvable flag. Numbers, frequencies, harmonic profiles. She was looking for the shape of the thing, the specific contour of whatever the engine couldn't name. Behind her, the calm traffic from Torrens Operations Center bled through the doorway, voices in 3 languages overlapping, the rapid-fire click of Corvathi technicians relaying status updates from every deck. Someone on Deck 14 was reporting that the port-side atmospheric processor had dropped to 60% output. Someone on Deck 3 was asking whether the evacuation corridors should be cleared. Torren answered without turning from Marin's console. Not yet. Clear the corridors at 20 minutes. There, buried in the harmonic profile of the power variance, a waveform pattern the engine had tried to match against its entire library and failed. It wasn't random noise. It was structured, repeating, and it had a feature that made Marin's hands go still on the datapad. The waveform had a biological signature. "This isn't a mechanical fault," she said. Torrens' engineers exchanged a look. "The stabilization array is mechanical," one of them said. "Corvathi Engineer First Class, name tag reading SCNNIK. It does not contain biological components." "I know what it doesn't contain. I'm telling you what the data says." Marin pulled the waveform to full screen and isolated the biological component. It was faint, a whisper underneath the mechanical noise, but it was there. A rhythmic oscillation that matched the metabolic frequency range of a living organism. Not Corvathi, not Dren, not Palori, not human. Senek leaned closer to the screen. His crest plates tightened, the Corvathi equivalent of narrowed eyes. That frequency range. It is similar to the metabolic profile of a Vrelki nest. What's a Vrelki? An organism native to our homeworld. Colonial. Bioelectric. They infest power conduits in older buildings. The taxonomy has extensive classification for them. Biological contamination, VRELKI class, codes 7700 through 7849. If it were a Vrelki, your engine would have matched those codes. It would have, it did not. Because this isn't a Vrelki, but it's something that lives in the same ecological niche, something that feeds on electrical systems. Different species, same appetite. Marin stood up. "I need to see it. Physical access to the stabilization array." "The array is in the outer ring. The corridor has been depressurized since the lock engaged." "Then I need a suit." "Specialist Voss." Torren's voice carried the particular weight of a Corvathi administrator who had been managing crises for longer than Marin had been alive. "The classification engine requires a taxonomy decision, not a field inspection. Classify the anomaly from here. The engine will release the locks. Our engineers will handle the physical repair." "I can't classify something I don't understand." "You have the sensor data." The sensor data shows me a waveform with a biological signature inside a mechanical system. That's not enough for a classification. I need to know what the organism is, how it got there, and why its metabolic frequency is interfering with your power grid. Otherwise, I'm guessing, and a wrong classification doesn't just fail, it locks the system harder. This was the part most species didn't understand about the Corvathi bureaucratic taxonomy. It wasn't just a filing system. It was a decision architecture. Every classification carried downstream consequences: routing protocols, resource allocation, legal liability, historical precedent. A wrong classification didn't just mislabel the problem. It sent the entire response apparatus down the wrong corridor. The taxonomy had a name for that: cascade misroute. It was considered worse than an unresolvable, because at least an unresolvable stopped and waited. A cascade misroute kept moving in the wrong direction, deploying the wrong teams with the wrong tools, and every minute spent fixing the routing error was a minute the real problem kept growing. Torrens stared at her for 3 seconds. His crest plates cycled through gray, then settled into reluctant agreement. Suit storage is on deck 7. I will have the corridor repressurized to the array access point. You have 20 minutes before I am required to begin evacuation protocols. I'll take 15. She was in the suit in 4 minutes. Corvathi emergency suits were built for Corvathi proportions: 4-jointed legs, extended thorax, crest plate clearance, but Cathara's joint species complement meant there were human-rated suits in the emergency lockers. Marin had drilled in one twice during her 12 years on station. It fit the way all emergency equipment fit, well enough to keep you alive, poorly enough to remind you that you shouldn't be there. In the suiting bay, a Palori dock worker named Hesk watched her seal the helmet. Palori were squat, wide-shouldered, built for cargo work, and Hesk had the scarred hands and measured posture of someone who had moved freight through decompressed corridors before. "You are going to the outer ring," Hesk said. Not a question. Palori didn't waste words on questions they already knew the answers to. Stabilization array, pylon 4. The corridor is cold. The grav plates in section 7 are fluctuating. Magnetic boots will pull left. Marin adjusted her boot calibration. "Thank you." The dock crew has an emergency channel. Frequency 447. If you need a second pair of hands in there, call it. "I might." Hesk stepped back. The look on the Palori's face was the same one Marin had seen on Torrens' engineers, the look of someone who understood that their survival had been placed in the hands of a single person, and who was choosing to trust that person because there was no other option available. The corridor to the outer ring was cold. Not the cold of space, but the cold of a structure that had stopped pretending everything was fine. The lights were emergency only, red strips along the floor that turned the corridor into a throat. Marin moved fast, her boots magnetic on the deck plating, her datapad sealed in a thigh pocket, her breathing loud inside the helmet. She could hear the countdown on the suit's comm, Torrens' voice, calm and procedural, announcing the remaining time in 3 languages. Corvathi first, then Dren, then Terran Standard. 29 minutes. In Section 7, the grav plates did exactly what Hesk said they would. The magnetic pull shifted left, hard enough that Marin had to brace against the wall and adjust her stride. Without the warning, she'd have stumbled. Without the stumble, she'd have reached the array 60 seconds sooner. But 60 seconds of stumbling in a depressurized corridor wearing an unfamiliar suit could mean a cracked faceplate or a torn seal, and either of those would end the classification attempt permanently. She made a mental note to buy Hesk a drink, if the station survived, if the commissary still existed in 30 minutes. Halfway down the corridor, she passed a sealed viewport. Through it she could see the curve of the planet below. Cathara orbited a gas giant's largest moon, a world of amber cloud bands and ice crystal storms. The station's shadow moved across the cloud tops, faster than it should have been moving. The orbital decay was visible now, not just in numbers on a screen but in the planet getting closer, the shadow shortening, the angle of the light shifting as Cathara dropped. A Dren family was pressed against a viewport on the far side of the corridor. 2 adults, 2 children. The smaller child had its face buried in its parent's shoulder. The larger one was watching the planet grow with the wide, unblinking stare of a child who understood that something was wrong but not what. The adults looked at Marin as she passed. She nodded, kept walking. The comm chattered. Deck 12, a water main had ruptured. The pressure fluctuations from the orbital decay were stressing the station's plumbing infrastructure. Torin dispatched a maintenance crew, his voice flat, and Marin heard the unspoken calculation behind the words. Every crew he dispatched to a secondary problem was a crew he didn't have available for the primary one. The station was developing new failures faster than he could respond to them, and the only thing that would stop the cascade was the one thing he couldn't do himself: clear the unresolvable flag so his systems could function. 27 minutes. The stabilization array occupied a chamber the size of a small warehouse at the station's equatorial ring. 8 massive pylons, each one a column of interlocking magnetic coils that generated the fields keeping Cathara in its orbital slot. The pylons hummed at a frequency Marin could feel in her teeth even through the suit's dampening. Between the pylons, catwalks and maintenance platforms created a lattice of metal walkways suspended over a drop that went down 30 meters to the array's cooling base. Marin stepped onto the main catwalk and pulled out her datapad. The biological signature was strongest at Pylon 4, the one closest to the station's hull, where the magnetic field was thinnest and the temperature regulation was least precise. She walked toward it, suit boots clanking on the grating, external sensors feeding data to her pad in real time. At the base of Pylon 4, she found it. A growth. Organic, layered, roughly the size of a human torso, adhered to the junction where the pylon's magnetic coil housing met the station's structural frame. It was bioluminescent, a soft, pulsing blue-green that brightened and dimmed in the same rhythm as the waveform on her datapad. The surface was textured like coral, ridged and branching, with filaments that had threaded into the gaps between the coil housing's panels and wrapped around the conduit bundles beneath. It was beautiful. It was also, very clearly, the thing that was killing the station. 25 minutes. Marin crouched on the catwalk and aimed her datapad sensor suite at the growth. The readings came back dense, carbon-based, silicon substrate matrix, metabolic rate consistent with a photosynthetic organism, adapted to electromagnetic radiation rather than visible light. The growth was feeding on the pylon's magnetic field. Its filaments had penetrated the conduit bundles and were drawing energy directly from the power distribution network, creating the harmonic interference that the classification engine couldn't categorize. Because the taxonomy had no code for a living organism that ate magnetic fields. She ran a secondary scan. The filaments weren't just feeding, they were growing. Even in the time she'd been watching, new tendrils had extended a fraction of a millimeter deeper into the conduit housing. The organism was spreading along the path of least resistance toward the strongest field lines. Another weekend it would reach the primary distribution node, connecting Pylon 4 to Pylons 3 and 5. Then the interference wouldn't affect one pylon. It would ripple through the central third of the stabilization array. A tertiary scan caught something else. The organism wasn't alone. At the base of Pylon 6, on the far side of the chamber, Marin's sensors picked up a second, much smaller biological signature. A nascent colony, barely larger than a closed fist, its filaments just beginning to probe the conduit housing. A spore from the main growth that had drifted through the chamber's air circulation and taken root. She relayed everything to Torin. It's not a single-point failure. There are 2 colonies, one mature at Pylon 4, one nascent at Pylon 6. The mature colony is causing the current interference. The nascent one hasn't reached critical mass yet, but it will. This organism reproduces by spore dispersal. If there are two, there may be more we can't detect yet. Silence on the comm, then measured. How does this affect your classification? It confirms the organism is colonial and reproductive, which changes the response protocol. A single organism gets extracted. A colonial organism with spore dispersal gets extracted, and the entire compartment gets surveyed for additional colonies. Different teams, different equipment, different timeline. This is why I needed to see it in person, administrator. 22 minutes. Marin opened the classification interface on her datapad. The unresolvable 7 flag stared back at her. All she had to do was assign a category. The engine would accept her decision, release the locks, and Torrens engineers could reconfigure the power grid around the compromised pylon. The orbit would stabilize. The countdown would stop. But the category had to be right. She scrolled through the taxonomy's top-level branches. Mechanical fault, no. Biological contamination, closer. But contamination implied pathogenic behavior. The downstream protocols for biological contamination included immediate sterilization, chemical, thermal, or radiological. Any of those applied to an organism physically threaded into live power conduits would cause exactly the kind of cascade failure she was trying to prevent. The chemicals would react with the silicon substrate. The heat would sever the filaments violently, leaving fragments inside the conduits. The radiation would ionize the organism's stored electromagnetic charge and release it as a single pulse through the power grid. Parasitic infestation, same problem. Parasites were defined in the taxonomy as organisms that harmed their host. The protocols for parasitic infestation included aggressive extraction. Engineers would pull the filaments out with tools designed for removing hostile organisms. The conduit insulation would shred. Bare conductors would short. Pylon 4 would fail catastrophically, and the sudden asymmetric loss of 1/8 of the stabilization array would accelerate the orbital decay instead of stopping it. Environmental hazard, natural, she lingered there. The growth was natural. Its interference was a hazard, but the subcategories all assumed non-biological sources. File it there, and the environmental team would flood the compartment with neutralizing agents designed for radiation or chemical contamination. The interaction between those agents and the organism's silicon substrate biology was completely unknown. Unknown in a compartment containing live power systems and a 30-meter drop to the cooling base. 19 minutes. Her comm crackled. Specialist Voss status. Working. The classification is complicated by the colonial nature of the organism and the risks of incorrect response protocol routing. The orbit is decaying. I know the orbit is decaying. I can see the planet getting bigger through the hull viewport. Rushing the classification is how we lose the station permanently instead of temporarily. You have the authority to make a provisional classification. Correct it later. Provisional classifications carry the same downstream weight as permanent ones for the first 6 hours. Your own taxonomy rules, Section 2100, Paragraph 3. The first 6 hours are exactly the window where the extraction team will be working inside the array. If the protocol is wrong during that window, the extraction fails and we're back where we started with less time. I will not file a classification I'm not certain of. His crest plates clicked through the comm, frustration, sharp and audible. But he didn't argue. The Corvathi respected their own systems, even when those systems were a rope around their necks. 17 minutes. Another alert. Deck 6 reported structural vibration in the spoke connecting the outer and inner rings. The orbital decay was introducing lateral forces the station's frame wasn't designed to handle at this angle of descent. The spoke structural monitors were flashing amber on Marin's datapad. If the correction didn't begin soon, the spoke would start to flex, and structural flex in a rotating station was the first step toward structural failure. A second alert followed immediately. The Dren delegation on Deck 8 had begun unauthorized evacuation to the upper ring, clogging the corridors that Torin needed clear for his engineering teams. Marin could hear him redirecting security, his voice steady but clipped, managing 3 crises simultaneously while waiting for her to resolve the one that controlled all the others. 15 minutes. The taxonomy's amendment protocol existed. The Korvathi had built their system with the understanding that the universe occasionally produced things that didn't fit. But amendment required a quorum of 3 classification specialists, 48 hours of review, and ratification by committee. She didn't have 3 specialists. She didn't have 48 hours. She had herself and 15 minutes, and a station that was coming apart one system at a time. There was another option, buried deep in the classification manual, a provision she'd found during her first year on Kethara while reading the full taxonomy documentation because she couldn't sleep, and the Korvathi didn't stock fiction in their public libraries. Section 4471, paragraph 12, Emergency Field Classification. An anomaly specialist could, in a crisis where delay threatened imminent loss of life, create a provisional new category by cross-referencing 3 existing categories and assigning a composite designation. The composite would carry full operational weight immediately and be reviewed post-crisis. 3 categories. She needed 3 that, combined, described the thing on pylon 4 accurately enough to route the response correctly. 3 existing codes pulled from different branches of the taxonomy, cross-referenced into something new. Something the engine had never seen before, but built entirely from pieces it already trusted. Marin looked at the growth. It pulsed. The blue-green light caught on the metalwork and threw soft shadows across the catwalk. A tendril extended, barely visible, reaching toward the next conduit junction. The smaller colony at Pylon 6 pulsed too, dimmer, younger but alive. First category, symbiotic organism, NON hostile. Code range 5450-5499. Reserved for organisms that colonize structures or other organisms without causing intentional harm. The key word was non-hostile. It would route the response to careful extraction rather than elimination. That mattered enormously. The organism had stored electromagnetic energy in its tissues. Marin's scans showed the charge density. Killing it suddenly would release that charge into the power grid as an uncontrolled pulse. The non-hostile designation mandated graduated energy dissipation before extraction. Second category, electromagnetic interference biological source. Code 3217, a theoretical subcategory under signal anomalies, created 200 years ago when a Korvathi research station discovered that certain deep space microorganisms could disrupt sensor arrays. Used exactly once in the taxonomy's history. But it was there, verified and valid. And its response protocol included electromagnetic shielding of adjacent systems during remediation, which would protect the other pylons from any energy bleed during the extraction of the Pylon 4 colony. Third category, infrastructure colonization, passive, Code 8803, from the Structural Integrity Branch. It covered scenarios where non-hostile biological growth had established itself in structural components without aggressive behavior. The response protocol specified conduit-safe extraction methods, tools designed to separate biological material from infrastructure without damaging the infrastructure. It also specified a full compartment survey for additional colonies, which the spore dispersal evidence demanded. 3 categories. 1 composite designation. 13 minutes. Marin opened the emergency field classification interface. 3 input fields for the parent codes. A text field for the composite designation. A confirmation prompt in 3 languages warning her that this action was binding and could not be reversed until the post-crisis review. Her fingers moved on the datapad with the precise, unhurried motions of someone who had spent 12 years doing exactly this. Taking the things that didn't fit and finding a way to make them fit without lying about what they were. She entered the parent codes, 5412, 3217, 8803. She typed the composite designation, passive electromagnetic BIOSYMBIONT infrastructure node, code EFC 2247 comp. She checked each cross-reference. The non-hostile protocol from 5412 required graduated energy dissipation. The electromagnetic shielding protocol from 3217 would protect adjacent systems during that dissipation. The conduit-safe extraction from 8803 would prevent infrastructure damage. The full compartment survey would catch any additional spore colonies. The protocols didn't conflict. They complemented each other, each one covering a gap the others left. 12 minutes. She stared at the submit button. If the composite was wrong, if the cross-references created a logic error the engine couldn't resolve, if the protocols contradicted in some subclause she'd missed, the classification would be rejected, and they'd be back to unresolvable 7 with less than 12 minutes, and a station that was coming apart around them. The Dren families would be trapped in the upper ring corridors. The spoke on Deck 6 would flex past tolerance. The atmospheric processors would fail one by one as the power grid remained locked. Marin thought about section 4471, paragraph 12. She thought about the people who had written it 1100 years ago, knowing that someday the universe would produce something their system couldn't name, and building a provision for the person who would have to name it anyway. They hadn't known who that person would be. They had simply trusted that someone would read the manual carefully enough to find the provision when it mattered. She submitted. The datapad screen went white. 2 seconds, 3. Her hand tightened on the casing, knuckles white against the gray housing. 4 seconds, 5. The engine was checking, running the composite against its decision tree, verifying the cross-references, testing the response protocols for logical consistency across all 3 parent categories. 6 seconds, 7. On the station-wide comm, Torin was ordering the Dren families to hold position. His voice was still controlled, but the gaps between words were shorter. He was running out of things to manage. Everything was waiting on Marin's screen. 8 seconds. Classification accepted. LOCKS releasing. Response protocols routing. The station felt it before she heard it. A vibration change, the deep, arguing hum of warring systems resolving into something coordinated, something that moved in the same direction. The emergency lights on the catwalk shifted from red to amber, then to white. On her comm, Torin's voice went sharp with controlled urgency, issuing orders to his engineering teams. Power grid isolation on Pylon 4. Electromagnetic shielding on Pylons 3, 5, and 6. Begin rerouting through Pylons 2 and 7. Orbital correction in sequence. Compensate for accumulated drift. Engineering teams to all stabilization array access points. Then a beat later, quieter. Bulkhead controls are responding. All bulkheads to standby. Evacuation corridors are to be cleared. Repeat, the crisis is being resolved. 10 minutes on the countdown. The first orbital correction hit, a lateral vibration that Marin felt through the catwalk and up through her knees. The growth's bioluminescence flickered. The pylon's magnetic field shifted as the grid rerouted around it, and the growth's feeding filaments pulsed brighter for a moment, adjusting to the changing electromagnetic landscape like a plant turning toward a shifting light source. Then the rerouting hit Pylon 6, and the nascent colony there responded. Marin's datapad screamed a new alert. The smaller growth, deprived of its food source by the rerouting, had released a burst of stored electromagnetic energy back into the conduit network. A pulse, small, but enough to trip a secondary fault in the grid reconfiguration. On the comm, Senek's voice, Power fluctuation in Sector 6. The reroute is destabilizing. Marin was already reading the pulse data. It's the second colony. The rerouting cut its food supply, and it discharged. Tell your engineers to shield Pylon 6 before they complete the reroute. The protocol I filed includes electromagnetic shielding of adjacent systems for exactly this reason. A pause, Senec conferring with his team. Then, the shielding is being deployed. It will add 90 seconds to the reroute sequence. 90 seconds they barely had. But the alternative was an unshielded discharge cascade that would undo the correction entirely. Take the 90 seconds, Marin said. She watched her datapad as the shielding went up around Pylon 6. The nascent colony's discharge tapered off. The reroute stabilized. The correction sequence resumed. 8 minutes. The second correction burn hit harder, sustained thrust from the maneuvering engines pushing Cathara back toward its proper altitude. The magnetic flux around Pylon 4 dropped, and the growth went dark. Not dead. Marin's sensors confirmed it was still metabolically active, but the rerouting had reduced the flux to a fraction of normal output, and the growth had responded the way any organism responded when its food source disappeared. It went dormant. The filaments relaxed their grip on the conduits. The bioluminescence faded to a barely visible glow. The harmonic interference dropped to 0. 6 minutes on the clock. The numbers on the chemical display stopped falling and hung there, suspended, stable, waiting for the final correction burn. When it came, Marin felt it as a gentle push, someone leaning against a door to close it the last inch. The display ticked upward. 1 increment, 2. The countdown froze at 0003:47 and held. Specialist Voss, Torin's voice on the comm. The flatness was gone. Something else was there now, a tone she had heard from Korvathi administrators exactly twice in 12 years. The orbit is stabilizing. Correction sequence will complete in 3 minutes. The countdown will suspend. Good. Your classification was accepted without amendment. The response protocols are routing correctly. The biological containment team is assembling per the protocol your composite specified non-hostile extraction with electromagnetic shielding and conduit-safe tools. Tell them not to kill it. A pause, the kind of pause that carried weight. It nearly destroyed the station. It nearly destroyed the station by eating. That's not hostile behavior, administrator. That's an organism doing what organisms do, finding food, growing toward it, living. Your taxonomy classified it as non-hostile for a reason, because I classified it accurately, and the response protocol for non-hostile biological symbionts is extraction, not termination. It is inside our infrastructure. A bird that nests in a rain gutter isn't attacking the house. You remove the nest carefully so you don't damage the gutter. You don't pour acid down the pipe, and you don't kill the bird. Torin was quiet for a long time. Marin could hear the station settling, the hum of the pylons finding their new equilibrium, the click and sigh of pressure equalization in corridors that had been holding their breath, the distant sound of engineering teams running through checklists with the focused energy of people who had just been told they were going to live. I do not know what a bird is, Torin said finally. Small flying organism. Builds nests in inconvenient places, completely harmless unless you corner it. And a rain gutter. Water drainage channel on a human dwelling, narrow, warm, sheltered. Exactly the kind of place a small creature would choose to live. Another silence. Then, the analogy is noted. The biological containment team will follow the extraction protocol as classified. The countdown display froze. The orbit held. Marin sat on the catwalk beside the dormant growth and watched it for a moment. The last flicker of blue-green light faded into the pylon's shadow. She reached for her coffee, remembered it was on the console 3 decks away, and settled for checking her datapad instead. The biological containment team arrived 40 minutes later, 4 Corvathi in sealed suits carrying extraction equipment specified by the composite protocol. Not the heavy sterilization gear that a biological contamination classification would have rooted. Not the aggressive tools that parasitic infestation would have called for. Gentle instruments, microcutters calibrated to cauterize biological tissue without heating conduit insulation, enzyme sprays for dissolving organic adhesive substrates, and a containment unit rated for electromagnetic organisms. Marin walked them through the organism's biology, the filament penetration pattern, the dormancy trigger, the nascent colony at pylon 6. She showed them where the growth had threaded into the conduit bundles and explained that pulling the filaments too quickly could score the conduit insulation, which would create a new set of problems the taxonomy was much better equipped to handle, but which nobody wanted to deal with today. The team lead, a Corvathi biologist named Sorrel whose crest plates showed the deep blue of professional focus, listened with the concentrated intensity of someone encountering a challenge she hadn't expected to find interesting. "You say it feeds on magnetic flux," Sorrel said. "Electromagnetic radiation in the magnetic frequency range. The filaments function as both root system and sensory apparatus. They seek out the strongest field lines and grow along them the way a plant grows toward light." "How long has it been growing here?" Marin pulled up the historical power variance data. 6 to 9 weeks, based on filament depth and estimated metabolic growth rate, probably arrived as a dormant spore on a supply ship hull plate. Reactivated when it entered the magnetic field around the pylons. It was small enough to fall below automated monitoring thresholds until it reached critical mass. 6 weeks. Sorrel's crest plates shifted, professional affront. "We did not detect a biological organism growing in our primary stabilization infrastructure for 6 weeks. Your monitoring systems are built to detect mechanical faults, power anomalies, and known biological threats. This organism is none of those things. It's a genuinely new category. That's why the engine flagged unresolvable, not because your systems failed, but because the universe produced something your taxonomy hadn't encountered yet. Your systems did exactly what they were designed to do. They stopped and asked for help." Sorrel considered this. "The universe does that. Frequently, that's why my job exists." The extraction took 3 hours. Marin stayed for every minute, not because she was required to, but because the organism was interesting and because she wanted to make sure nobody killed it. Sorrel's team worked in pairs, one technician cutting, one monitoring conduit integrity in real time, while the other 2 managed the containment equipment and documented everything. Marin sat on the catwalk 3 meters away, datapad on her knees, running continuous electromagnetic scans of the organism's tissue as each filament was severed. Every time a filament was cut, the organism released a tiny pulse of stored energy barely measurable, but Marin logged each one. The pulses were getting weaker as the extraction progressed. The organism was bleeding charge. "The discharge rate is decreasing," she told Sorrel. "Each filament you cut releases less energy than the last. Consistent with a capacitive storage model, the organism stores electromagnetic energy in its main body and distributes it through the filament network. As you remove filaments, the total storage capacity drops and the per-filament discharge decreases." Sorrel's crest plates shifted, interest. "That means the risk of a large, uncontrolled discharge decreases as we progress." "It does, but it also means the main body is still holding a significant residual charge. When you detach the main body from the pylon housing, that charge will have nowhere to go. You'll want the containment field active and grounded before you make the final separation." "Noted." 90 minutes in, a complication. One cluster of filaments had penetrated deeper than the surface scans showed, threaded through the conduit insulation, and wrapped around the bare conductor beneath. The filaments had grown into the conductor's surface, their root structures bonded to the metal at a molecular level. Pulling them would sever the conductor. Leaving them meant the organism retained a biological foothold in the pylon's power system. Sorrel looked at Marin. Your classification specifies non-destructive extraction. It does. These filaments cannot be removed without destroying the conductor. Marin thought about it. Not long, she had already considered this possibility when she'd examined the filament depth during the initial inspection. Don't remove them. Isolate the conductor, reroute the circuit, and let the filaments die naturally when the power is cut. They'll desiccate and become inert in a few days. Your taxonomy has a code for inert biological residue, 5612. File it and move on. That leaves biological material inside a classified power system. Inert biological material, no different from dust on a shelf. The classification for inert biological residue explicitly states it requires no active remediation, just periodic monitoring. Check it once a week. When the filaments are fully desiccated, sweep them out during the next scheduled maintenance. Sorrel's crest plates shifted, reluctant admiration. You have a code for everything. Your people wrote the codes, I just read them. At the 2-hour mark, a more serious complication. Sorrel's team was working on the filaments connecting the main growth body to the pylon's primary coil housing when one of the technicians bumped a microcutter against the housing itself. The contact was minor, a tap, barely audible, but it sent a vibration through the housing that the dormant organism interpreted as a change in its electromagnetic environment. The growth's bioluminescence flared. Not the soft, slow pulse of dormancy, a sharp, bright flash that lit the entire catwalk in blue-green light. Sorrel's team froze. Marin's datapad screamed 3 alerts simultaneously. Nobody move, Marin said. She was already reading the data. The organism had partially awakened. Its metabolic rate had spiked. The filaments still connected to the conduit network were drawing power again, not much, but enough to destabilize the rerouted grid configuration if it continued. Sorrel, can you increase the containment field strength around the main body? Yes, but increasing the field may be interpreted by the organism as an increase in available electromagnetic energy. It may fully awaken. It may, but if it fully awakens while its filaments are still connected to live conduits, the interference pattern returns and we lose the grid rerouting. The containment field is grounded. If the organism tries to feed on the field, the energy dissipates harmlessly. Sorrel considered this for 2 seconds. Then she adjusted the containment field. The invisible barrier around the growth intensified. The organism pulsed again 2, 3 times brighter each time, and then, as the field's grounded energy refused to sustain it, settled back into dormancy. The bioluminescence dimmed. The metabolic rate dropped. The filaments relaxed. Capacitive bleed, Marin said quietly, logging the event. It tried to feed on the field, couldn't sustain intake because the field was grounded, and went back to sleep. Useful data point for future encounters. This species can be lured into dormancy by surrounding it with grounded electromagnetic fields. Energy it can sense but can't metabolize. You are taking notes during a crisis, Sorrel observed. The crisis is over. This is science. The two look similar from the outside, but science has better coffee. The main body detachment took 40 minutes. Sorrel's team dissolved the adhesive substrate with a targeted enzyme cocktail mixed on site. 3 different enzymes in a specific ratio that broke down the silicon organic bonding matrix without damaging the pylon housing's metal surface. The organism came away in one piece, a coral-like mass trailing severed filament stumps, glowing faintly in the containment field. Beautiful, in the way that living things were always beautiful when you stopped long enough to look at them properly. The residual charge discharged safely into the grounded containment field as the main body was lifted free. A brief, bright pulse that made Sorrel's technicians flinch and made Marin write 3 lines of notes. They extracted the nascent colony from Pylon 6 next. Simpler, smaller, less established, its filaments shallow enough to pull cleanly. Sorrel's team bagged it separately and noted the spore dispersal pathway between the 2 colonies. A full compartment survey was scheduled for the following day, per the composite protocol. Marin recommended they also check the conduit junctions in the adjacent maintenance corridors. If spores could drift from Pylon 4 to Pylon 6 through the chamber's air circulation, they could also have entered the ventilation system. Marin followed the containment team to Deck 4. The biological research bay was a bright, clean space, daylit panels overhead, equipment arranged with the precise spatial logic the Corvathi applied to everything. The organism was transferred to a long-term containment unit, a cylinder of electromagnetic shielding with an adjustable internal field that could simulate various magnetic environments. "We'll feed it," Sorrel said, adjusting the containment field's parameters. "Low-level magnetic flux, enough to sustain it without allowing growth. We want to study its reproductive biology, its electromagnetic signatures, its growth rate under controlled conditions. If there are more of these organisms drifting through space on hull plates, we need to know what they look like before they colonize another station." Agreed. And if the administrative Concord asks whether it should be destroyed as a precaution. Sorrel looked at the organism in its containment unit. It pulsed, slow, dormant, blue-green, alive. "I will reference the classification protocol. Non-hostile organisms are extracted, not terminated. Your classification, Specialist Voss, your protocol. Your taxonomy, I just used it properly." Marin went back to Deck 9. The countdown display still read 00, 03, 47, frozen, waiting for the formal clearance that would come through proper channels. She sat at the diagnostic console and opened the incident report template. 412 required fields. She was on field 217 when Torin found her. He stood at the edge of the console bay, crest plates the neutral blue of post-crisis reflection. "Specialist Voss. Administrator. From the moment you arrived on Deck 9 to the moment the classification was accepted, 27 minutes elapsed." "Sounds right. Of those, 11 were spent in discussion with me, 4 in transit, 4 examining the organism, 8 on the classification itself. My engineers spent 47 minutes before you arrived attempting to override the lock. They could not. That's by design. The taxonomy doesn't allow non-specialists to make classification decisions because non-specialists don't understand downstream consequences. A Corvathi engineer would have been tempted to classify it as a mechanical fault, because mechanical faults are what engineers understand. The response protocol would have routed to mechanical repair. Your people would have tried to pull the organism out with wrenches. The filaments would have shredded the conduits. The power grid would have cascaded. And you'd have lost the station trying to fix it faster. It is not a flaw in the system. It's the system working. The lock exists to prevent exactly that kind of well-intentioned mistake." Torin's crest plates shifted into a pattern she hadn't seen before, something between acknowledgement and something deeper, something she suspected the Corvathi didn't have a word for and would therefore need to classify. "I'm observing that the entire crisis, locked systems, decaying orbit, 17,000 lives, was resolved by a single human who understood our bureaucratic systems better than our own specialists." "That's not what happened." "It is precisely what happened. What happened is that I used the tools your civilization built. Section 4471, paragraph 12, emergency field classification. A provision your own architects created 1100 years ago because they knew the universe would eventually produce something the existing categories couldn't handle. I didn't outsmart your system, administrator. I used a part of it that nobody had needed to use before. The smartest people in this story are the ones who built the provision in the first place. Torin was quiet. Through the viewport behind him, Cathara's shadow drifted across the cloud tops at the correct speed, the gentle pace of a station holding its proper orbit. I have administered this station for 23 years. I was not aware of section 4471, paragraph 12. It's in the manual. The manual is 900,000 pages. 912,000. The atmospheric chemistry sections are the longest and the most tedious, but they're in there for a reason, administrator. He made the sound again, the low clicking of crest plates that indicated something had been recognized as both unexpected and correct. Not quite a laugh, something better. Specialist Voss, I will be recommending to the Administrative Concord that the anomaly specialist complement on joint stations be increased from 1 to 3. Good idea. Make sure all of them have read the manual. She finished the incident report, all 412 fields, and submitted it through the classification engine by 6:20 station time. Field 218. Describe the method of classification. She typed, Emergency Field Classification per Section 4471, Paragraph 12. Composite designation EFC 2247 comp built from 3 existing categories. Symbiotic organism NON hostile, 5412. Electromagnetic interference biological source, 3217. Infrastructure colonization passive 80803. Composite describes a previously uncategorized colonial electromagnetic feeding organism. Response protocols routed correctly. Recommend formal taxonomy amendment to establish permanent category. Field 219. Was the anomaly hostile? No. Field 220. Was lethal force applied? No. Field 221. Was lethal force considered? No. The diagnostic screen had cleared. Unresolvable 7 was gone, replaced by a clean classification entry. EFC 2247 comp. Passive electromagnetic BIOSYMBONT infrastructure node. Status, resolved. The amber-white color the console had invented was gone too, replaced by standard blue-green. The system had a name for the thing now. Naming was the first step toward understanding. Understanding was the first step toward not dying. In the corridor outside Deck 9, Marin passed Hesk. The Palori dock worker was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching the viewport. The orbit is stable, Marin said. I know, I've been watching since the correction burns. The shadow speed is correct. Hesk paused. The grav plates in Section 7 are still pulling left. I'll file a maintenance report. I already filed one. Code 2247, mechanical fault, gravitational subsystem, calibration drift. The grav plates have been pulling left for 3 years. It's a design flaw in the mounting bracket. Korvathi dimensions don't account for thermal cycling in human-rated corridor sections. Marin stopped walking. You read the maintenance manual. I work on the docks. I move cargo through corridors. The corridors have systems that break. Reading the manual seemed faster than guessing. It is faster. Hesk unfolded her arms. You read the entire taxonomy manual, 912,000 pages. Most of it. I'm on page 647,000. Why? Marin thought about it. Because this station is my home, and I wanted to understand how it works, all of it, not just the parts assigned to me. Hesk nodded. The nod of someone who understood the answer, because they had given the same answer, about a different manual, for different reasons that were fundamentally the same. The coffee in the commissary is strong today, Hesk said. The blend from the Torelli root. Thank you. In the commissary on Deck 5, the coffee was hot and strong. Marin drank it at a corner table, datapad open, scrolling through Sorrel's preliminary notes on the organism. The biologist had already cataloged the filament structure, the metabolic frequency range, and the silicon substrate matrix composition. Thorough work. Corvathy science, methodical, documented, everything in its proper category. A message from Carrick at the Terran Division's regional office, 4 transit jumps away. Marin. Read the incident report. Impressive work. The Taxonomy Committee has expedited the review 2 days instead of the standard 30-day queue. Kale made a personal request. She typed back, "Good. In the meantime, there's a new species of electromagnetic feeding colonial organism that travels on hull plates. Issue a sector advisory to every station within spore-drift range of our trade routes. The organism is non-hostile, but if it colonizes a power system and the local classification engine can't categorize it, the system locks will engage. Not every station has someone who's read section 4471. In her quarters that night, Marin opened the taxonomy manual to page 647,112. Atmospheric chemistry of gas giants with metallic hydrogen cores. She read 12 pages, made 2 notes in the margin, and fell asleep with the datapad on her chest. She dreamed about blue-green light pulsing in the dark. Not threatening, not hostile, just alive, feeding on what it found, growing toward what it needed. In the dream, the light had a name, but she couldn't read it because the letters were in a language the taxonomy hadn't classified yet. The next day, the compartment survey found 3 more dormant spore colonies, 2 in ventilation junctions, 1 on a maintenance platform near Pylon 2. All nascent, none large enough to cause interference. Sorrell's team extracted them using the same composite protocol. Marin classified each one under TXC 9901 provisional, a holding designation for specimens of a species pending formal taxonomy review. On the 3rd day, Sorrell's full analysis arrived. 17 pages. The organism was, in her assessment, a genuinely novel species, not a variant of any known electromagnetic feeding organism in the Corvathy biological registry. Its silicon substrate matrix was unlike anything in the comparative database. Its reproductive biology, spore dispersal through ambient air currents, with spores capable of surviving vacuum transit on ship hull plates, suggested a deep space origin. The organism had likely been drifting between star systems for centuries before a supply vessel unknowingly carried it to Cathara. The proposed species name, translated from Corvathy formal nomenclature, quiet light that feeds on what it finds. Marin read the name twice. She saved the report. The review committee convened that afternoon, 7 members in a Dalek conference chamber on Deck 2, 4 Corvathy taxonomy specialists, 2 Dren observers, and Marin. They reviewed everything. The composite classification, the sensor data, the biological analysis, the extraction report, the spore survey results, the full incident report. They reviewed section 4471, paragraph 12, which 3 of the 4 Corvathy specialists admitted they had not previously known existed. The 4th, Vorath, had read it 30 years ago and forgotten it. The Dren observers asked about reproductive capacity. Marin presented the growth rate data, 6 to 9 weeks to critical mass, assuming a stable magnetic food source. The Dren observers exchanged a look she recognized as the expression of a species that maintained 17 stations of their own and was already calculating which ones were vulnerable. One of the Corvathy specialists, a younger one named Toril, asked the question Marin had been expecting since she filed the classification. Your composite designation uses the term symbiont. A symbiont provides benefit to its host. What benefit does this organism provide? None in the conventional sense, but the term symbiont in the taxonomy's code 5400 range includes organisms that colonize without causing intentional harm, regardless of reciprocal benefit. The distinction is between symbiont, which coexists, and parasite, which actively harms. This organism coexists. It doesn't attack infrastructure. It doesn't reproduce aggressively enough to overwhelm systems quickly. It feeds, grows, and eventually its interference triggers the classification engine. The organism itself has no hostile behavior. Toral's crest plates shifted. The distinction may seem academic when the organism nearly caused the loss of the station. The distinction is the difference between an extraction protocol that saves conduit integrity and a sterilization protocol that destroys it. It's the difference between studying the organism and learning its biology and destroying it and learning nothing. The distinction is not academic. It is the entire point of having a taxonomy, to ensure that our response to a problem matches the actual nature of the problem, not our emotional reaction to it. Quiet in the chamber. The daylight from the overhead panels caught the edges of the conference table Corvathi design, smooth and functional, every surface serving a purpose. Through the viewport, the planet's cloud bands turned slowly beneath them. The station held its orbit. The countdown display on Deck 9 reads 000347, frozen, a number that would be cleared through proper channels in its own time. Then Vorath spoke. The classification stands. Proceed to vote. The vote was unanimous. A new permanent category in the Corvathi bureaucratic taxonomy, the first in 67 years. Passive electromagnetic, BIOSYMBIONT. Code TXC 9901. Response protocol, non-lethal extraction, biological containment, power grid isolation, conduit safe removal, full compartment spore survey, mandatory anomaly specialist consultation. They adopted the species name, quiet light that feeds on what it finds. After the meeting, Vorath approached Marin in the corridor. Deep gray crest plates, 41 years on the committee, 11,000 classifications reviewed. Specialist Voss. Specialist Vorath. Your composite classification, it was elegant. It was functional. They are often the same thing. The slow crest plate pattern of a professional compliment being carefully delivered. 41 years, 11,000 classifications. Yours is the first that used the emergency field classification provision. It was the right tool. Your ancestors put it in the manual because they knew a situation like this would come. The organism you classified, quiet light that feeds on what it finds. It is, in its way, a metaphor. For what? For the anomaly specialist who understood our system well enough to save us from the gap between what the system knew and what the universe presented. Vorath's crest plates settled into the deepest gray, the color of something being said once and never repeated. You are the classification the engine could not make on its own. Marin looked at Vorath for a long time. That's the nicest thing a Corvathi has ever said to me. I will deny having said it if asked in a formal proceeding. Naturally. She walked back to her quarters. The station hummed around her, steady, settled, 17,000 lives in a structure that floated in the dark and stayed where it was because someone had built the machines to keep it there. And someone else had built the systems to classify everything the machines encountered. And one human had read those systems cover to cover, because she believed that understanding something completely was the only honest way to be responsible for it. On Deck 4, behind a containment field, quiet light that feeds on what it finds pulsed softly. Blue-green, steady, the rhythm of something alive waiting to be understood. In her quarters, Marin Voss opened the taxonomy manual to page 647,112. She'd fallen asleep on this page 2 nights ago. The atmospheric chemistry section was genuinely tedious, but somewhere in those pages there might be a paragraph that would save a station, a provision nobody remembered, buried in a section nobody read, waiting for the one person who would need it to find it before the countdown reached 0. She turned the page. The station held its orbit. The countdown display on Deck 9 reads 000347, frozen, suspended, waiting for the formal clearance that would come through the proper channels, stamped and countersigned and filed in the correct category, because that was how things were done. And doing things properly was the reason 17,000 people were still alive to complain about the paperwork. Bureaucracy, it worked. You just had to read the whole manual.